Thank you very much, Hannah. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you today. So I propose to discuss some aspects of early golf, particularly early golf in Scotland and England. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the 15th to 17th century. So in the reign of, primarily I'll be talking about events that took place in the reign of these four Scottish monarchs. I'll touch on perhaps some earlier information as well. But that's what I'll be focusing on in the talk today. So I think it's reasonably well established that the earliest written reference to the word golf is in the Scottish Act of Parliament from 1457, where both football and golf were banned, and that was by James II, and primarily because there was a hope that might encourage people to practice archery. The earliest recorded golf match, or at least the earliest documentary evidence for a golf match where we know the identity of both of the players, was in 1504. So King James IV had a golf match with the Earl of Montrose. So this is recorded in the Lord High Treasurer's accounts. The reason it was in those accounts is almost, I suspect, because the king lost a wager, and therefore the transaction was recorded there. Now, there's been a lot of speculation by golf historians about where that golf match may have taken place. It's been, I think the predominant view is probably that it might have been in Edinburgh, and it's been suggested that James IV spent the whole of the month in Edinburgh. I'm not convinced that is the case. It's been also suggested, somewhat tentatively, that it may have been at St Andrews, and I'm going to present some evidence that I hope will convince you that this earliest golf match actually did take place here in St Andrews. So it may be useful to just give a little bit of the historical background. So shortly before this golf match took place, the king appointed his brother as the Archbishop of St Andrews. So his younger brother was actually still too young to be officially appointed as Archbishop, and there's been some speculation that the reason that James IV did this was because the considerable revenue that would come from the diocese of St Andrews would flow to the king. And in fact, when his brother died, when this Archbishop died, he appointed his illegitimate 11-year-old son as the next Archbishop of St Andrews. So there is something, there may be some truth in that. However, the Archbishop died, the king's younger brother died, just days before this golf match took place. And this is recorded in those same treasury accounts and in other early documentary accounts that still survive. He died in Edinburgh, but was buried in St Andrews. And the funeral took place in St Andrews just 5 days before this record of a golf match. So if one looks at these accounts, it's documented very clearly that the Archbishop died, that his body was transported to St Andrews, that the king himself passed from Edinburgh, spent some time in Falkland. He made a payment to the ferryman at Queensferry, and it's clear that the king himself bought items that would be appropriate for mourning prior to a funeral. He bought black cloth for a mourning gown, he bought black horse, he bought black cloth to put on the horse. There are a lot of other purchases in the treasurer's account that indicate that this was quite a lavish funeral. There are records of 300 dozen arms, which are thought to be flags or banners for the funeral. The king clearly spent some time in Falkland prior to this golf match, as you might expect, stopped at his residence in Falkland, and there are records of transactions there. But the day of the funeral, which was the 29th of January, there are records in those accounts in St Andrews of payments to both the Greyfriars here in St Andrews and to others. And that was just days before the golf match took place. A couple of days later, there's an entry indicating the purchase of golf clubs and balls. So it suggests that he stayed in the same golfing location for a few days. Now, it's not absolutely conclusive proof, perhaps, but it seems to me that it's more plausible that the earliest golf match that we're aware of took place here at St Andrews. We know he came here for the funeral, and it's very likely that he stayed in the same place for several days. So I think I would argue that is likely to be the location of this earliest golf match. In fact, we know where the king was buried. He was buried in front of the relics of St Andrews that were brought here, as legend says, by St Regulus. It's clear where that tomb is, and it still survives today. It's that enormous tomb that you're probably familiar with here in St Andrews. About 3 meters, or the stone on top of that tomb is about 3 meters by 2, a very substantial stone, and probably thought to have had a brass inlay at one point, which really isn't there at the moment. So there have been many suggestions about where this golf match took place, but the evidence in support of any of these other locations is I think, really rather flimsy. And I would suggest that it's certainly as plausible, perhaps more plausible, that the golf took place here. I like this image of St Andrews from the 16th century, because it shows both the castle, the cathedral on the right-hand side of the image, and also the links on the top left-hand side. So previously, the earliest reference that was unambiguously indicating golf in St Andrews was this document signed by another Archbishop of St Andrews, who I believe was hanged for murder. So these archbishops are an interesting group. But if you believe that it's plausible that this golf match took place in St Andrews, that would push back the date at which we have evidence of golf being played here by about 50 years. And I think it would be rather appropriate that the modern day home of golf may well have a claim to be the location of the earliest known golf match. So one of the things that I've been interested in is looking at accounts that are published in golf histories. And many of them frequently, claims that are made, frequently don't seem to be supported very clearly by contemporary documentary evidence. So one of my interests has been to try and look to see whether there is ever any clear evidence for claims that are made, and often made and repeated very frequently. So one is that King James V played golf at Gosforth. Now, it seems entirely plausible. We know that his father, King James IV, played golf, and King James VI played golf. It's highly likely that he was familiar with the game of golf. But the claim that's frequently repeated is that he played golf at Gosford. Yeah, so that's in East Lothian, just near Longniddry. And it really, the origin of that story, as far as I can tell, is this account that was written 250 years after the event, which stated that King James V is said to be fond of Gosford, and it was suspected by his contemporaries that in his frequent excursions to that part of the country he had purposes in view besides golfing and archery. So I think this was really written in the 18th century, and it was just an allusion to the fact that people in the 18th century were familiar with the fact that golfing and archery were activities that might take place in East Lothian. It's not a suggestion, really, that James V himself golfed at Gosford, but these comments tend to take on a life for themselves. And so subsequent golf historians, I think, have seen that and made statements such as John Kerr, who said that there does not appear to be any doubt that he played at Gosforth, he frequented Gosforth with his golf club, he was a regular on the links, and so on and so forth. Another account tells us that James V is recorded as having played at Gosforth, where later the famous Earl of Weems had private links. Now that's correct. So this is he was a politician in the 19th century and did have a private links at Gosforth. And indeed, it's been suggested that he objected to people taking divots and insisted that people played only with wooden-headed golf clubs. James Kerr again said at the time that whether this is entirely true, I'm uncertain, but James Kerr tells us in the Golf Book of East Lothian that Weems came up with the idea of this club that he called the Unionist, and he called it the Unionist because it doesn't wear the green. Now that's a joke that probably only works if you remember that it was a time of Irish nationalism, and the Irish Home Rule Bill had just been defeated by the Unionists, and of course no self-respecting unionist would wear green, the colour of Ireland. But this story again takes on a life of its own, and we're told in this publication from 1966 that James V set up a private links and spent many pleasant hours competing with his favourite golf companion, the Earl of Weems. Now, he died 250 years before Weems was born, but anyway, and James V was so particular that he committed only woodheaded clubs. So you get the picture, the idea. And we could go on. James V had time to set up his own golf course. So James V was the father of Mary, Queen of Scots, and of course it's inevitable perhaps that there was suggested to be a link between James V, a golfing link between James V and Mary, Queen of Scots. It's been said that he taught his daughter to play golf. He passed on his love of the game to his daughter. And that in itself is implausible if one recalls that Mary, Queen of Scots was only 6 days old when James V died. So this may be stretching things a little. But certainly Mary, Queen of Scots has a special place in the early history of golf. It's not completely undeserved. It has to be said, because there certainly is an important historical document that refers to golf and mentions Mary, Queen of Scots. And it's what's known as the Hopetoun manuscript. But it was a document that was drawn up by English diplomats, really primarily with the aim of discrediting Mary prior to her trial in England. So this was shortly after the murder of her second husband in Edinburgh. And this account tells us that a few days after the murder, Mary went to Seaton in East Lothian, taking exercise right openly in the fields with Pall Mall and golf. So it's there in black and white. There is a contemporary document mentioning that Mary played golf. However, I think it has to be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt. It was a document aimed at discrediting Mary, but nevertheless it exists. Other accounts at the same time don't mention golf, but that doesn't mean that she didn't play. So there were an English diplomat who wrote a first-hand account. So this was someone who you would be expecting to provide accurate information. This wasn't a document intended to discredit her at her trial. This was part of the regular diplomatic correspondence between this diplomat, William Dury, and William Cecil, who was the chief advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. And he recorded that at this same time, when Mary had gone to Seaton, she was engaged in archery. A history that was drawn up shortly before her, again by probably the group aiming at discrediting her, this chap George Buchanan, who published a famous detection in 1571, which was one of the documents that was put together as part of the trial. And he said at the time that she was engaged in sports clearly unsuited for women. So there is that link, and that does give her a place in golf history. But it has to be said, if you look at all the other accounts, and there are plenty of them from this period, treasury accounts and other accounts, that document in great detail activities that Mary Queen of Scots was involved with, and there are many instances of records of payments or activities relating to other sports and interests, and none of it which mention golf. But despite that, I've come across at least 20 different locations that have been proposed as a location where Mary played golf. And this is a lot of golf to have been played, because other than the first 5 years of her life, when she was probably rather young to be playing golf, Mary only spent 7 years of her life in Scotland, that time between her return from France and her exile in England. But there's something about the mystery of Mary Queen of Scots to the Scots, I think, that a heroic figure who was executed in England. And there's a sort of wish and a hope, I suspect, that I don't know, who knows why, but there's a lot of stuff written about Mary Queen of Scots being an enthusiastic golfer. We're told various different accounts have described her as an avid golfer, a talented, a fanatic. She had a golfing obsession. She was addicted to the game. Could go on. She played golf very often and quite well. But we must remember that we only have that one piece of evidence. Inevitably, there were going to be links with Mary Queen of Scots and St Andrews. I think this was popularised due to this image that was included in the Illustrated London News in 1905, called Mary Queen of Scots playing golf in St Andrews, and that's led to various accounts that tell us that certain it is that Mary played golf at St Andrews. She frequently indulged in the pastime of golf in the windy dunes of St Andrews. She certainly visited St Andrews, but I'm not aware of any evidence to say that she played golf in a saddle. One other myth I think I'll just mention, which is quite an interesting one. It sort of illustrates how myths can start and evolve. So this necklace was sold at auction in, when was it, 1894. The auction catalogue described it as being a necklace which was given by Mary Queen of Scots to Mary Seton. So perfectly reasonable, and seemingly no obvious link to golf. However, that same week, Golf magazine took this story up, and they added that the necklace may have been given in memory of some lost golf match. Clearly no reason for suspecting that, but these things then tend to evolve and take on a life of their own. We hear in the Golf Book of East Lothian that the relic is therefore interesting as a gift of a royal lady golfer who more than likely played with the Queen of Seton. We're told that it's recorded that she was in the habit of playing golf with Mary Seton, etc., etc. Perhaps Mary lost to Mary Stewart, and she gave her a necklace. One more recent description of this event tells us that Mary often golfed with her ladies-in-waiting, and that this necklace was given after losing a golf match. So one can see perhaps how these stories evolve and develop. Now, James VI, there's been a lot of interest in whether James VI was a golfer. This document describes after James VI had moved to, after the union of the crowns, and he moved his court from Edinburgh to London, there is a record of a payment to a golfman at Royston, and so that's often cited as clear evidence that James VI played golf. It turns out, however, that those accounts are the accounts of his pal, the Duke of Buckingham, rather than James VI himself. So it may well be that the Duke of Buckingham could be attributed as being the earliest Englishman known to have played golf. There are records of the king being given, or the prince being given 2 golf clubs in his youth. So it's very likely that he was involved in the game of golf, but of course there's no clear evidence that he actually played with them. what we do know, and is very well reported and documented, is that James VI appointed William Mayne as a club maker in 1603, and that was just before moving his court from Edinburgh to London. And it's widely and quite reasonably assumed that the clubs that this bowmaker and spearmaker was making were golf clubs, but it's not absolutely certain. So I was rather interested to find some evidence that I think indicates clearly that that is the case. So these treasury accounts were published in 13 volumes many years ago, and as a consequence are very easily accessible to golf historians and to others. But the printed accounts stop halfway through the reign of James VI. However, there are accounts from this later period which weren't published in that 13-volume account and therefore are less well known, but they still survive. And I came across this entry which talks about payment to William Mayne Bower for certain spears and golf clubs furnished to him for His Majesty's use. So it's clear that William Mayne was making golf clubs, and also that he provided them for the King's use. So I think this is a very useful document if one cares about whether or not James VI played golf. I think this provides definitive evidence. I also came across the testament dative of William Mayne. That's a sort of rather like a will drawn up at the time of his death, listing all his possessions, and in amongst that it records 3 club shafts. Again, it doesn't say whether they were golf clubs, but we have that other evidence suggesting he made golf clubs. But at the same time, in his inventory, it records golf balls, which is rather interesting. One would expect the trade of making golf clubs and balls to be separate, and they may well have been. It may be that he was selling golf balls made by someone else. But anyway, that's some rather nice additional information about this bowmaker, William Mayne. So I now want to just move into the last part of the talk, really, and discuss early golf in England. Now, it's been suggested that golf may have appeared in England around 1513, and in fact various golf historians have argued that. It's been said that James IV introduced the game to England on his visits to the royal court. James IV, of course, died at the Battle of Flodden Field in 1513. Now, the reason this date comes up, and it's been suggested that this may have been when golf moved from Scotland to England, I suspect, at least the origin of this story, I believe, is this book that was written, a memoir of Anne Boleyn, that was written by Elizabeth Benger in 1821. Now, in this memoir, she transcribed several letters written by Catharine of Aragon. One particular letter appears to mention golf. And it was a letter written when the king was away fighting in France. Catharine of Aragon was Queen Regent and wrote regularly to the king, and seemingly told him that his subjects were busy with the golf. They take it for a pastime. Now this, I believe, is erroneous, but it's been repeated very, very frequently. It's become almost ubiquitous in golf histories that Catharine of Aragon wrote about golf in 1513. However, that letter survives in the British Museum, and in fact has been transcribed and studied by many historians, and almost universally all non-golf, all regular historians who are not particularly, have never suggested that this letter was anything to do with golf, but in fact is talking about preparing for battle with the Scots. And that makes perfect sense if one reads on. It says, "My heart's very good, I'm horribly busy making standards, banners and badges." Standards and banners are things that one would need in preparation for battle, and they were gearing up because the king was away in France. James IV saw that opportunity to invade England from Scotland. Just shortly after this letter was written was the Battle of Flodden Field, and where the king was done. But it's very clear, I think, and it's easy to see how the mistake was made. That the letter S of Scots looks very much like a capital G, but it's an error which has been has permeated all areas of golf history. As I say, it's been repeated very frequently, but it also, and this is sort of another theme, these myths begin and get repeated and tend to evolve and take on a life of their own. So it's been said, for example, that Catharine of Aragon was one of the first female golfers. Henry played tennis, whereas Catharine preferred golf. She amused herself with golf while her husband was away, etc., etc. And there's really no evidence, like a simple mistranscription of a letter that was written by. So it's an easy mistake to make, but it just, it illustrates how once these sorts of errors have been made, they can perpetuate. So I think it's much more likely that golf moved from Scotland to England at the time of the Union of the Crowns. After the death of Elizabeth I, James VI of Scotland moved his court to London. He became James I of England. And it seems very likely that those golfers who were part of his court, and he himself, may well have started to play golf in England at that time. And of course, wrapped up in that is a theory which suggests that, and you may well have seen it suggested that golf originated in England at Blackheath. So the sort of orthodox view is that the court moved from Scotland to England at this time, that the court was based at Greenwich Palace. Scottish members of the court would have played golf, and because of the proximity of Greenwich Palace to Blackheath, that may have been where, of course, there is a golf club today, which is where golf may first have been played. So I'm interested in looking at the evidence to support that supports that. And there are really two documents that are often cited in support of this theory. There's a document that describes Prince Henry, James's son, playing golf under the supervision of his tutor. That's a document that was published round about 1608. But also, less well known, I think, is a letter written by the French ambassador around about this time in 1606 that suggests Prince Henry played golf. But certainly it's become very widespread, the belief that golf in England originated in the area of Blackheath. Certainly was suggested by Robert Browning. Bernard Darwin himself said the Royal Blackheath Golf Club, which is justly proud, that it was instituted in 1608. I think most people would probably accept that even if golf was played at Blackheath in 1608, there's really no continuity between that possible event and the modern day golf club. But nevertheless, it was interesting to look at these documents and see whether there actually is any evidence that golf was played at Greenwich and Blackheath. Now, the first of these documents is a document which survives in the British Library. It's called the Harley Manuscript. It actually is a document, a handwritten document, that covers a period of several years of Prince Henry's life. It was somebody who knew him very well and was close to him. And it records about, it records him lifting up his golf club to strike the ball. So very clear evidence that Prince Henry played golf. But there isn't really any indication of where this took place. This document has about 90 different unrelated anecdotes that are described through a period of several years. There is one anecdote amongst the 90 which describes the visit of the palace at which the Queen had her court. Prince Henry was raised separately from the King and Queen from a very early age, and he spent most of his time, it seems, at either St James's Palace in Westminster or at Richmond Palace. So it brings me now to this second of these two documents, which was a letter written by the French ambassador. These survive, these letters, and they were published in 1790. In one of the letters, he says, he talks about, this is a reference to Prince Henry and says that he plays willingly enough at tennis, and another Scots game that's very like Pall Mall's. And the French wouldn't have been familiar with golf, and it seems highly likely that what he's talking about here is golf, a Scottish game that would be like Pall Mall. Now the story, the background to this is quite important. So bubonic plague had broken out in London at this time. The king had left London for one of his hunting lodges, and the French ambassador, who appears to have met regularly with the king, was unable to do so. And so he visited Prince Henry. Prince Henry, it seems, was in Richmond Palace at this time. Now, there's a whole series of letters. I think there's about 30 letters written this year from the ambassador back to the French court. And all of those, except two, written at the end of October 1606, are written from London, de Londres. This particular letter that mentions about golf is signed de Richemont. It's very clear that the French ambassador had left London and gone to visit Prince Henry in his palace in Richmond, and it's almost certain, I think, that this reference to golf, him playing golf, which is the only contemporary document we have that can be accurately dated and accurately placed. And it appears to have taken place at Richmond and not at Greenwich or Blackheath. In fact, a copy of the letter survives as well in the French National Museum, and again is signed at Richmond the last day of October 1606. So I would suggest that if we were going to identify the earliest known place in which golf was played as anywhere, it's actually more likely that we could identify Richmond, 15 miles west of Greenwich or Blackheath. So I think really it's probably, there isn't, as far as I'm aware, any real evidence that could be used to support the claim that golf was played in Blackheath in in this period, 1608. Nevertheless, I think that Blackheath could justifiably claim to be the oldest club in the world. Okay, so that brings me really to the end of that period. I've just talked about early Scottish golf and some research that I've been doing into early golf in England. And I just wanted to spend the last couple of minutes talking about some very recent research that I've been doing, which ties in with what I've talked about today, because it's yet another example, I believe, of a golf myth which is evolving and actually becoming very, very widespread. And it's slightly worrying that these things can take on a life of their own to such a large extent. So it concerns references that I've seen increasingly to the sale of a golf ball for 10 shillings in 1452. Fair enough. So as I said at the very beginning, I think there's a lot of evidence. This is very clear. You can't dispute that there was this reference to golf in 1457, and it's widely assumed to be the earliest written instance of the word golf being written. So it would be remarkable if there was a document which described the sale of a golf ball for 10 shillings a few years earlier than this. And I was just curious to see if anyone had ever cited any evidence to support this. I'm a scientist by training, so you can see that I like the idea of sort of plotting cumulative frequency graphs. But one can see a sort of steady rise in the incidence of these claims of a golf ball being sold at 10 shillings. And they all seem to originate, as far as I can tell, in 1968. So I've now expanded the x-axis here, because this is the entire written history of golf. And you can see that something happened in the later stages of the history of golf. As far as I can tell, I mean, I don't really name names, but as far as I can tell, this claim first appeared in a book published in 1968, almost out of nowhere, really. It talks about, in the middle of a paragraph with no references cited, it says that the first recorded sale of a golf ball 1452, the price 10 shillings. So there is no indication of where this information may have come from. So the book was reviewed that year in this newspaper, and the embellishment starts. And here, the newspaper, in reviewing the book, put golf with an E in inverted commas, almost implying that there was a document and that this was how golf was spelt in that document. A year or two later, the same story appears, but here we're told that it was a feather golf ball in the Director magazine of all places. Again, same story appeared, and we're told that there have been constant improvement since 1452. I'm giving a very selected number of examples, I can give many more. This was an anthology of golf that was produced by the Worthington Golf Ball Company. 1452 was the origin of the feathery. This is a book that actually rather emphasises the hints that there were documents that exist that really support this claim, but again, no document was cited. We were told in Golf magazine that, again, it was a quotation implication that there was a document, the spelling's different here, but we're told here that it was a ball made of down-filled leather. It even appears in the Tampa Bay Singles Golf Association newsletter, so it's becoming very widespread. This was an internet a series of slides, first golf ball. These sort of timelines appear very frequently in books. Here it's a ball made of beech and boxwood. This article tells us that documentation is the golf historian's Bible, and the earliest references for it, but disappointingly didn't cite the document. I have asked the author to say. So I come back to this. I think this is very, you can be confident here. We can see the document, we know where it is, and it exists. What's even more worrying to my mind is that this has sort of spiraled off into what is clearly an error. And I think it's because often historians have seen this claim that this is the earliest written reference to golf, and then remembered perhaps that there was another document about the sale of a golf ball in 1452, and tried to reconcile those two events. And so you will see an increasing number of references now saying that golf was banned by James II, not in 1457, but in 1452. And this sort of additional offshoot of the myth, it appears to have started around 2007 with the wonderful world of Wikipedia. Now, the Wikipedia is wonderful, but its downfall is that anyone can write on the Wikipedia website. So the entry 10 years ago said that referred to the known reference from 1457, and rather unhelpfully, I think, someone has added to that, but there is an earlier reference to the game, and it's believed to have happened in 1452 when King James banned the game. So I've only ever edited Wikipedia once. I did it to delete that a few weeks ago. But it's just spiraling on. So this is actually, I found this on, you find anything now on the internet, that's why this research is so much easier now. This is a US high school which is teaching the fact that in 1452 King James banned golf. Another internet site. This is a rather wonderful thing, I think it's called an infographic that I found. I spent a lot of time producing this. But the first entry tells us that the earliest known reference to golf is when golf was banned in 1452, not 1457. It's the origin of golf. But it's not just Britain, it's not just England, it's gone worldwide. So I was rather pleased to find the Kazakhs, one of the top golf club in Kazakhstan on their website announced that perhaps the most truthful and generally accepted version of the golf origin is that, according to which golf appeared in Scotland in 1452. This is a trilingual website, so the same things in Kazakh and Russian. It's appeared in a Chinese website. This story is in Vietnamese, Japanese, Italian. The Italians rather imaginatively linked it to when Leonardo da Vinci was born. Thai, Polish, Hebrew, and I'm pleased to say it's even found its way into Esperanto. So Wikipedia apparently is transcribed into Esperanto. And finally, I found this. It's the first golf ball ever made. It's a wooden ball, and it was made in 1452. So it just illustrates how, I mean, it's undoubtedly, surely a myth, unless someone, Peter can tell me, he knows of the 1452 document, but I really don't think it exists. So, I think this is the earliest reference to golf. I think this is the earliest reference to a golf ball. It's the document I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. I wonder how it all originated, and I suspect it may just have been a simple error. There is a record of golf balls being sold for 10 shillings. It was the accounts of the Earl of Montrose. It was about 175 years later, and I just wonder whether perhaps the author sort of half remembered this story and you know, innocently got the date wrong. I think that's perhaps the most plausible explanation. But it does show how these myths can evolve and take on a life of their own. So that's all I want to talk about. Most of what I've talked about has been presented in various different articles through the Green, the magazine of the British Golf Collectors Society, and they will contain any or all of the references and sources that I've talked about. So anyway, thank you very much. That's very much.